All right, so welcome to the second lecture in the Visualization and the Sciences class. This one is talking about motivation in terms of what is useful about visualization. If you're a scientist, why would I want to spend my time doing this? Or if you're a computer scientist, why would I want to spend my time doing this? And also motivation on why it matters that you pick the right techniques and you think about what's the most appropriate, not just the easiest. And then I'm going to go very practically through some toolkits that you can use. Two of them that we'll be using for homeworks in the class, and then a bunch more that you can use for final projects, on your own projects, and afterwards. So this one, the video doesn't play on its own, so let's bring it up over here. Right. Is a simulation of explosion in a container that's heated with a flame until it bursts and it kind of explodes. So there's a 3D simulation at this scale, a 2D high resolution simulation as a slice through that, and it kind of shows you what's going on the outside and the inside of this combustible barrel.
They're not in phase, are they?
They're not in phase, yeah. And then we're kind of going to zoom in and see what happens near one of these fracture points. Right. And then 4T CT image data. So this is computed tomography data that is time-varying data. So this is a person's heartbeat and breathing. They're taking the slices very quickly and then replaying them. And of course, the thing we're going to find out in the volume visualization lecture is 3D is hard because the stuff in front hides the stuff behind. And if it doesn't, then you can't see the stuff in front. So what do? Right? And so there's a lot of techniques for how do you slice things up, how do you remove things you didn't want to see, how do you pick a viewpoint or a kind of a trajectory that lets you understand what's going on in this. And we're hoping to apply this to some geophysics data, some geology data as part of it, one of the homeworks here at least. And so there's, doing different colors to separate different objects, different clipping planes, different transparencies on different materials to kind of give you a mixture of looking at the different components. And then doing this all over time so you can kind of watch what happens. Now there's a trade-off here between kind of sitting still and seeing the whole thing behave in one location and being able to look around to see different things. And so it's an interesting question, but can you keep the context while it's kind of in motion?
There's this funny result that if you diddle it just a little bit, it actually helps you see it in 3D, right?
Right, so if it's moving, it actually gives you a better 3D effect.
Oscillating, yeah.
That's right. Yeah, in fact, we'll talk about the torsion pendulum being the best way to kind of have something going as you're trying to understand its shape. But any motion of the object helps you understand the 3D shape better. Best if it's coupled to the head motion so that it kind of sits still and looks like it's there in space. All right.
That's creepy.
3 very different examples. Oh, there's creepier examples coming later. All right, so if you didn't get an email from me today saying welcome to the email list, please send me an email saying please add me to the email list. If you tell me, I might remember, I might not, but if it's in my inbox, I'll stick it in there. Peer review and vol view. So the tutorials are now online, the upload is available, so you should go ahead and try downloading peer review, running it, downloading vol view, running it, taking the images, uploading it onto the WordPress site for the homework for the class. Put it as a private post, and what we'll do is you'll all do private posts, and then on the day of the assignment, I'll make them all public, right? So it is technically possible for you to look in the media gallery of the WordPress if you're savvy and look at people's submissions before you turn yours in. I'm asking you not to do that. It would be an honor code violation, and we do, of course, have web logs of who looked at what when. So if you feel tempted at the end, remember that in the back of your mind. That'll help you avoid the temptation to do anything. All right. Ideas for final projects. I've got, we're talking to one on Thursday, talked to 2 already, so they're coming in. If you've got a project, I'd like to hear about it, what data sets, what kind of questions you have, so we can get the homeworks lined up and start getting the data curated. And then be sure you've got the Commonwear book. I think they might have some at the student stores. I put some on there. Had anybody gone over there to see if they have them? Yeah, and so if you can't find it on Amazon, then run over there and you can get one there. Start reading. The first 4 chapters come on fast. All right, so which was your favorite visualization example from the multi-form section in Keller and Keller? Visual cues. Anybody have a favorite? Do they remember which one it was?
My favorite's the inner ear one.
The inner ear,
Yeah.
yep. So this was one that showed them that the structures there are organized for kind of parallel processing to all decide that they're all pointing down. I'm trying to find where that is.
155.
155. So what did you like about that particular one? Which of these displays did you like better?
The one on the left, I think, is the one that shows the parallel.
Uh-huh.
But what's so crazy about this is that if you just cut away one of the panels, it looks completely different. One of the, if you make one of the front blobs
Transparent, and then all of a sudden it
Yeah.
looks like this.
Yeah.
Uh-huh. Yes, it's so very different when you do that. Uh-huh. Yeah, so it turns out here that having several images at hand can be better than having any single image of that. This was my favorite. And it was basically, I like this one because it shows how important the choice of color map is, right? So you talked about how do you change, what you're including, and that certainly has an impact. And this is, the 2D version of that. As you change the color map, you can see kind of the top map shows this outline of the surrounding void with the jet very clearly highlighted, but doesn't show internal structure very well, right? But the bottom one shows the internal turbulent structure of the jet very well, but actually I have a hard time telling where the edge of the jet is, right? And so different visualization techniques, different choices support different questions. And so we're going to be talking about why it's important to understand what question the scientist is asking, because one of these is good to answer one question and the other one's good to answer the other question, and they don't kind of either one answer both questions very well. All right, so in this class, we're going to go both kind of high-level theoretical approaches to things to do with visualization, and then also very practical issues in visualization. And we're actually going to do that in this lecture today as well. So we're going to start with kind of theoretical understanding of why visualization works, why is it helpful, how does it help people to have visualizations, and then some very practical lessons learned when they did use them. So basically, the person is good at hypothesis, right? Goal-directed searches, pattern recognitions, and decisions in the presence of error and uncertainty, right? We make those decisions all the time. Should I go to the bus now, or should I try to grab a Coke on the way, right? You don't know the answer to that question, but you're going to make a choice, and you're going to go with it. The computer is good at perfect recall of facts and quantitative display of complex models, right? So when we imagine things, we don't have the complexity in our brain of every detail, but we have an idea of the gestalt. So putting these two systems together, if you think of them as systems, right, to kind of dehumanize the human, and think about what's the interface between those, well, visual channel is the highest bandwidth channel from the computer into the person, right? And so the visual channel is the one we would tend to think about for getting the most information in there quickly. The haptic channel, this is touch, is the only bidirectional modality, right? Unless you're kind of shooting laser beams into your eye, which you don't want to do. And so you're both manipulating the simulation or the data and feeling the results of that manipulation at the same time, right? So you can actually interact with the simulation, interact with some quantities and feel them and adjust them at the same time. All right, so Colin Ware talks about the human-machine problem-solving loop, right? And he says that people solve problems differently with diagrams than without diagrams. And he makes a couple of very strong claims that seem a little almost ridiculous, but he then supports them. One is that visualization functions as memory extensions. You have more memory at your disposal when you've got a visualization out there. And the second, he says that visualizations let you do operations that would otherwise be impossible. You can do things with the visualization you couldn't do without a visualization, right? And he has this loop of, okay, here's the computer, it's got a model, it makes a visualization, you look at it, you adjust some parameters, you look at it again, you're looking around a different location, you look at it again, and he sees this as kind of the man-machine problem, woman-machine problem-solving loop, okay? So, why does he support, how does he support these claims? So, this is 3 ways to play the game tic-tac-toe. right? So on the left is the one you're familiar with. You line things up until 3 X's or 3 O's are in the same row, column, or diagonal. In the middle, you pick 3 numbers until they add up to 15. Any set of 3 numbers, you add up to 15. And on the right is you pick one until you get the same symbol in all 3 of those rows. These are equivalent ways of playing tic-tac-toe. So people, I tend to like the way on the left of playing tic-tac-toe. Computers like the way in the middle of playing tic-tac-toe, right? And so if I had to play tic-tac-toe with the middle way, it's not as easy for me to do. I don't have the visual cues telling me, uh-oh, there's already 2 in a line. I have to do some strange math in my head to figure out, what's going on. And so in this case, the tic-tac-toe board serves as external memory to me, or kind of, it shows me, without me having to think about it, what's happening and what should I do next. And so this, understanding how this extends your memory, you need to talk about what is human memory like. So there's, this is where it's helpful to have a perceptual psychologist write the textbook, right? So there's iconic memory. This is the image of the last thing you saw, still in pictorial form, or the trace of the last bit of sound you heard, still in kind of looping inside your head, right? This is very helpful in my marriage, right? Because my wife comes in, la 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 la, I'm typing on the computer, I stop, I realize she said something to me, it's right there, my iconic memory, I can listen to it again. Ah, yes, I will help you carry the laundry basket upstairs, right? It's not lost, right? It's so kind of recover. So there's kind of iconic memory, there's a visual thing. If you close your eyes, you have this brief kind of restoration of what happened before. Then there's working memory, and this is a little bit more hard to describe. It's basically where you do your thinking, right? And there's 7 plus or minus 2 chunks of information that can be stored. And what a chunk is, people have argued about the whole time I've been in, looking at research. I don't think they know the answer yet, right? So an area code is a chunk, 919. If you have a number that's got 919, boom, you remember that, my area code, and then whatever. If it's 723, it's 3 numbers, right? You can't chunk those, right? And so this is basically why phone numbers used to have 7 digits, right? Because you can remember 7 digits, most people, and so it's fine. Now you have 10 digits, and one of them's not the area code, and you can't remember phone numbers anymore, right? Send me just call me, right? Because I can't remember the phone number between now and writing it down, because I can't run it through, and I can't do my work. All right. You have to have concentration to hold this for more than about 3 seconds. Then there's kind of long-term episodic memory, which is like, how do you ride a bike? How do you write in cursive? Those of us can write in cursive. It's a network of linked concepts where the firing of one triggers the firing of other ones, and kind of recognition prompts recall. And so it's a vast kind of, this is where our knowledge lives. This is where our learning lives, our skills live.
And that stuff is, a lot of what you've listed there is non-declarative. Like you're not, you couldn't explain to someone how to ride a bicycle. You just know how.
Yep.
Right.
But a logical proof might also be in there. The orders of a proof for declarative.
Yeah.
All right. So visual spatial reasoning, again, lets you, these kind of operations take place directly in the visual field, right? So tic-tac-toe, you don't have to kind of internally keep an idea of what's going on the board. You can see it right there. With B, you need this internal computation. So this basically means the problem can be partially externalized. So part of what you used to be doing in your head, now is not doing in your head. It's just happening there in your eyes, right, in your early visual system. And this gives you an increase in overall capacity. So a concrete example helps with this. So my wife and I planned a trip out west, and we were going to go see all these places that we ended up not going to all because it's big out there. But we had to plan our trip, right? Well, where do we want to stop? Okay, well, if you just stand around and think about where you want to stop and what's near where, it's hard. But if you look, oh, we're going right past this. What's this Valley of Fire State Park? I've never been there. Let's go see if that looks interesting. And so having the map out there lets you kind of record some interesting and ask queries about small details that you don't have to keep a whole web of interconnected distances in your head, right? Again, a computer would rather have a list of distance to distance and solve some graph problem, but we're better at externalizing that and thinking about where we'd like to go, not how close is everything to everything else. So it actually lets you do things you couldn't do without the map. So I'm convinced that it makes sense. All right. And so now kind of he's like, okay, well, visualization may help me, but if I'm a domain scientist, maybe I'd rather be in the lab taking some data, understanding what's going on with my system, right? If I'm a computer scientist, maybe I want to be writing a new raycasting algorithm or publishing a new paper, or be thinking about my technique development rather than working with a scientist to help them display their data. And so for computer scientists, we're going to have a number of examples today of how it was useful to a scientist to learn things, and then for the computer scientists, we'll talk about why you would want to do that. So the basic answer for the domain scientist is if mathematics is the queen of the sciences, then computer graphics is the royal interpreter, right? What do I mean by that? You run a computer simulation of the thing you're trying to understand, you get a pile of numbers in some big matrix. I didn't want a pile of numbers, I wanted to know what was happening in the actual world. You get an experiment, you sample things from the real world, you get, a pile of numbers. The question is not, what's the detailed number here, but how does this, what's going on in this system? How does it relate to the things that are around it? How are the details in context? And so computer graphics can take those numbers, put them back into context, and then let you think about them in a way that's useful to the thing you're trying to answer. For a computer scientist, so basically the fundamental reason is that computer science is a synthetic discipline. We make things for people to use, right? We don't discover new facts about computers. Look, everything in there is stored in a binary code. Oh yes, we made it that way, right? Oh look, there's a little adder thing in there. Yes, we made it that way. And so basically getting to know your users and their needs is a big part of creating things work well. And there's other benefits as well, right? And so if you're trying to solve a problem, come up with a dissertation topic, and the scientist is pushing you to actually solve this problem, you may go somewhere you wouldn't have gone if you were just sitting in your office thinking, well, what can I do for a quick algorithm that I would like to adjust? It may force you to do that hard parts. And so necessity is the mother of invention. This may be an artificial way of getting some kind of necessity into your life. It's a good test of whether your system is useful. This can be humbling, right? So does the professor actually come over and use my system, or did he just talk about it in the talks but doesn't use it? And for me, it's interesting that it teaches you a little bit about other disciplines, right? And so, this morning I learned a little bit about how you do tomographic measurements of the Earth's crust, and you're going to learn about a little bit of that, later. Yesterday I learned about how you tell how old cores are drilled in the base of the ocean, and how you will time align these things by the way the Earth tilts when it goes around the sun, right? These are not things I would have come across in my normal computer science, lifetime. I don't have to take a class to figure it out, right? I just talk to the scientists and they explain to me what's going on. And then for me, it's a lot of fun to be there when your collaborator uses this tool and they say, I did something that I couldn't have done if I hadn't had this tool, right? I planned my trip out west and I couldn't have gotten there if I didn't have this map. Right? It's more like I pushed this, kind of bead across this field into a gap, and I couldn't have done this without this nanometer tool, right? And it's like, oh, this is really cool. They're actually doing things that they couldn't have done without that. All right. The other thing, from a larger viewpoint, is as a community of scholars, this lets us attack problems that are larger than any discipline could attack by themselves, right? And so because we have computer scientists helping to build a tool with physicists that goes down and pushes things to the nanoscale that biologists can use to measure DNA and its interaction with the virus, they can learn something about that biology that we wouldn't have known if we didn't have that tool that they could go in there and use, right? And as a computer scientist, I would never have known anything about how viruses behave. As a physicist, they can do anything, of course, but it takes them longer if they have to do it all themselves. And as a chemist, they're very happy to have help. And so these are different projects that we worked on. And then one of these, Chris, so bad with names, Dwyer, first graduate student, he used this all in reverse. We had this collaboration going. He said, I want to use DNA to self-assemble carbon nanotubes into 3D supercomputers. I'm like, wow, blowing my mind. And so he went and talked to Sean Washburn and Leander Ricci and Dorothy Urey in chemistry, assembled a committee, and his job was to prove it's not ridiculous to do that, right? He didn't have to build one to get his PhD, but he had to show that there wasn't some fundamental problem with going forward with that. Very interesting dissertation.
Where can I buy one of those?
Where can you buy one of those? Yeah, if you're the
No.
NSA, maybe, but I
Yeah.
don't know otherwise. All right, but there's some issues, right? So there's some reality checks. When you start to work with other disciplines, how do you even talk to each other, right? And so Rich Superfine and I were having a conversation about interfaces, and I was talking about the interface being transparent and natural, and he's talking about the interface being adhesive and specific. I'm like, adhesive? That's disgusting. And of course, he's talking about the interface between the carbon nanotube and the substrate, and I'm talking about so even just normal words that you would normally use get kind of confusing. So, I used the word slab this morning in a discussion, and slab is a technical word in the field that they were talking about, and so that took the conversation off in another discussion. I just meant a flat thing, right? And so, basically you go back and forth and you define terms and it works out, and it's sometimes funny, but whatever. That turns out not to be hard. I'll give you some examples when I lecture on how to talk to a scientist. funding is actually one starting to kind of cure itself, at least in the U.S. Now it's almost every call is like we need multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary. That we've kind of almost gone to that extreme end of you need to have multiple people thinking. It's a good idea. Those of us who've been doing it for a long time are excited to see that happen. Of course, you also need basic science. And so, that problem is not as much a problem now as it used to be. And then credit, right? And so if things go well, there's enough credit to go around, right? And so when my colleagues got on the cover of Nature because of the pictures we helped them and the science we helped them do, I was a tiny little co-author in the middle part where it was the least important author thing, which is really cool. I would never have gotten the co-authorship on a Nature paper, which is great, except if I were going for tenure, if it was on the tenure track, I'd be a little worried because the computer scientists would sit around and say, he's on Nature, BNAS, science. Does he do that stuff? If he does, is he a computer scientist? And so, in this department, I would not worry about it so much. But on the other hand, the reason I'm in my position is because for 3 years running, Rich Superfine said to the dean, what we need is somebody between the departments to bring this all together, right? And so, on the one hand, there's positions that are being made. There's understanding of the benefits of this. If you're kind of going for a strict discipline tenure, you want to talk to people about, in the place you end up, is this a reasonable way to go about it? It should be, but it's not always. All right. And the last thing is wasted time, right? And so about a third of the time as a computer scientist, when I work with scientists, I'm writing them a picture, making them a picture for their publication, or helping them with some display that has nothing to do with novel computer graphics, novel visualization. It's just applying known techniques to help them what's going on. All right. So the cost is the time spent as a servant, right? The payoff is, but I've got this wonderful data set now that I can use my thinking on, and I've got some questions that nobody else in the world is asking about how do you do this with the data, and I've got somebody who's willing to be a bit of a guinea pig and say, tell me does this work, tell me does this work, tell me does this work, and guide me towards a more better solution, right? So realize that there are costs, and you need to kind of pay those, but realize that the benefits can outweigh the costs in this particular thing, even beyond the excitement of being part of a team that's doing all this. All right. So now to the very practical level as a scientist. So this is useful for a computer scientist, for a domain scientist to say, well, what might I get out of visualization? What would I, if I invest some time in this, what am I likely to learn? As a computer scientist, it's examples that you can give a potential collaborator of, here's what you might learn if we work together on this thing, to give them an idea of what that might be. And there's no yet fundamental theory of how this all fits together. It's more, here are some examples of work that's been done. So I'm going to give some examples kind of by category. I by nature like to organize things, and of course some things aren't organizable, so they're in the other techniques, but there's viewing spatial data, viewing transform spatial data, and so forth. Many of these are drawn from visual cues, and so you'll be seeing these as you go through the book, but I pulled out the ones where they explicitly describe something that they learned from that. Others are for case studies in the visualization conference literature over years. Others were from other people on campus or collaborators that I had particular results that they found. And I didn't want kind of general, oh, I like it, it makes me see better. No, this is the thing that we could do afterwards because we had this that we couldn't do otherwise. So starting with the Keller and Keller, this is showing 2D data, 2D simulation data as 2D data. This is not earth-shaking stuff, right? So this was looking at a simulation compared to experimental data to look at the accuracy of a material mixture dynamic simulation. And they basically showed the results in the area of interest, and they compared kind of what they expected with what they got. And like there's what is going on with this thing here, kind of low resolution, high resolution. That doesn't show up in the experiment. What's going on? And the answer is that this is actually a computational domain that's toroidally mapped, right? So this edge kind of bleeds over to this edge, and this edge bleeds over to this edge, and that's one of the choices you can make in simulation. So this stuff is kind of going off the left and right. That wasn't supposed to happen, right? And so this is kind of experimental debugging, right? Simulation debugging. You're just kind of seeing, is the simulation doing it all what I expected to do? And about half the time when we first get a data set from a scientist, we look at it and they say, nope, your simulation, or your visualization is wrong because this never happens. Okay, well, let's look at the data. Oh, gosh, that's in the data. This shouldn't happen. We didn't know that this was happening because we hadn't looked at it. So when you look at your simulation output, just to look at it anyway, often you'll find, uh-oh, something's not going the way it should go. So this is spatial showing surfaces as surfaces. So this is string theory manifolds, high-dimensional manifolds projected down into 3-space. And the question is, where do singularities occur? Where do more than two kind of things touch at the same point? 3 sheets come together, everything shrinks to a kind of infinitesimal point, and that gives you ideas of where in this hypothetical space to look for interesting math and interesting string theory. And so this was a group at Klemenko at Freiburg University built for looking at this. And they basically would adjust their system until they saw these interesting behaviors, then query where those were, and then go off and do the math to understand why that was an interesting behavior, what was going on at that particular point. So this basically helped them in hypothesis formulation. Why does this happen at this particular convergence of parameters? What's going on in this particular display? Spatial, showing 3D data is 3D data, right? And so this is, again, not rocket science, but it turns out to be very useful. So this is looking at internal microstructure of steel, right? So it's like the visible human, but with steel. They slice it, they look at it in the TEM, they slice it, they look at it in the TEM, and they get a bunch of slices. There's also some fiducial marks. So these are just things they've driven through there so that they know how to line up each slice with the previous slice. They're just there to kind of line things up. All right. And so here along the top and the left are some of the individual slices that they looked at from the steel. And in the lower right is the 3D reconstruction of the whole thing, right? But it turns out that these cementite particles in the middle that look like they're hanging out in the middle of nowhere, when you look at them in 3D, really attach from one end to the other, right? So they're always building bridges across that. And that's something you don't realize if you're just looking at them individually. The other thing, it turns out, I don't think you can see this particularly well from this viewpoint, but where these attach to the boundaries, there's a thinning in the boundary, right? And so that's something that's hard to see in 3D because you're not looking at the angle you want it to be looking at in every case. And so this showed them features about how kind of steel was being formed that they didn't understand by just looking at the 2D slices back together. All right, so the take-home message for spatial data, why would you, what would you want to do, is that if you know a particular question that you want to have answered, often a slice view or a numerical thing can give you a better answer. If you don't know everything about the data, this viewing the spatial data can turn up new information or surprising things that were in your data that you didn't know about just by looking at it. All right, so this is transformed spatial data. So this is a cross-site stereogram. So what that means is if you're lined up with the axis of the screen and you hold up your finger in front of that and fuse those two into one, you'll get a 3D image of these kind of beams wrapping around a sphere there. If you're off axis, you'll get a headache. So this is the UNC R-Space program. So this is trying to plan X-ray crystallography data so that you covered the entire parameter space with some of your X-ray views. So if you look from one view, you cover some part of the frequency space. You look from another view, you cover another part. So this basically maps the kind of directions back into a surface cover to show you, okay, have I covered the entire surface of this sphere with my various things? Otherwise, where should I take another viewpoint, right? And so it's basically inverse mapping from the Fourier domain back into the real space domain to take a beam and turning it into a coverage map so you can figure out what's going on. So this turns out that it enabled faster and better planning of strategies for data collection, and so at the time it was widely used for doing that. So this is looking at plasma turbulence simulation. And so to make the computation not take forever and take more memory than there is in the universe, they basically made the computational domain follow the kind of the lines on the device itself. And so to understand what's going on, these magnetic field lines are in field line following coordinates. And if you just look at them kind of in 2D of one versus the other, they go in circles, they connect to each other in ways that don't make sense. So they basically took those, mapped them back into 3-space so you could see in 3-space how these simulation domains came together. And that gave them a better understanding of these lines kind of coming together and then quickly ripping apart. And they could see phenomena in the 3D spatial domain that they map back onto the right data or not. So if you're doing longitude and latitude data, question, did you want to map that back onto the surface of the Earth and see kind of this thing was close to this thing even though it's on the other side of the map in the display. So remapping data can help with that. All right, so the spatial is fairly obvious. It's surprising how frequently people don't take the time to do this, right? And so in your designs, one of the things you want to think about is what's the right space to look at this in, right? Is it the original data space or is it some other transform space that would make more sense for answering the question? And it can make it easier to interpret. All right. combining multiple sets. Most of science, a lot of science is how does this compare to that, right? How does these two things driven by this third thing? And so how do you display multiple data sets? And so basically, this was a group at Brown University looking at the rate of strain, turbulent charge, velocity, and vorticity in a flow simulation over a blunt wing, right? So here's an airfoil wing down here. There's airflow blowing over top of it. This is actually a 2D slice through a 3D simulation, right? But it's symmetric in the third dimension, right? So it's just the same wing, uniform, going that way. So the ellipses basically are showing, what is this? So this was showing that turbulent charge. So this is the rate of strain tensor, right? So it's a second order tensor. And so the strange thing that they found was some of the spheres, circles had less area than others, right? So what does that mean? That means that the area, because it's area preserving, the volume preserving, must be sticking out of the screen, right? All right, so what that means is that there's some flow going in and out of the screen, which there's no reason to think ahead of time that would happen because it's a symmetric, it's just symmetric in that way. But no, turbulent flow is happening, not in the plane, which is where they were looking at it, but out of the plane and back in. And so looking at these displays, there's multiple things together, let them see where the regions were and how they compared to other different data sets.
Perpendicular to the flow of the air across the wing?
Perpendicular to the net flow of air across the wing.
That's bizarre.
Mm-hmm.
And this is actual flow, or is this, you said it was a second order
It's simulation.
tensor?
It's a second order tensor derived on the actual flow velocity data.
Okay. I don't really know what that means, but.
All right. All right, combining multiple data sets. So this was looking at the Pittsburgh Supercomputing Center. It was Nuja and Lorig, I guess, looking at time-dependent simulation of ozone over Los Angeles. And so this was then tied to ozone measurements made throughout the day and night. At night, the measurements were dropping, so it looks like they were getting less ozone at night and more ozone during the day, and that kind of made sense. But when they actually looked at the simulation, they realized that what was happening was at night it was going up and the day coming back down. The night going up and the day coming back down. And so tying the two data sets together showed you that a feature that seemed kind of interesting in one, we need to worry about production during the daytime, turned out not to actually be the issue, that there was something else going on because the other data set showed that. So it turns out if you're controlling a robot arm, and the robot arm follows pretty quickly behind what you're doing, you do kind of motions. Like you want to pick up that drink, you would reach down, grab, pick it up. If there's a latency between when you tell it to move and when it moves, you're very uncertain about what's going to happen. And so you got to go little move, little move, little move, little move, little move, grab. Right? So it takes a lot longer to do that. But if you have a latency that you know what's going on, you can superimpose, here's what they did, a wireframe of where the robot actually has been commanded to go, hasn't gotten to yet. And then you can have confidence that indeed you're not running into the screen and you can go around and pick up the drink. And so by superimposing a kind of this is what we've commanded and we expect to happen, you could then do much more facile control of this. This was, orbiting in a space station or something, or orbiting in the shuttle. And so that, basically there had to be latency from the ground to there. So this was two different things. A picture of the second one is shown here. And this was Liz Bullitt at UNC in surgery, looking at tumor surgery. And so one thing is when they're doing tumor surgery, they have the kind of MR scan ahead of time, and they know what structures they expect in the brain. And then when they're in there, sorry, this is one of the gruesome parts, things swell up, and they're removing things, and blood gets in there, and it can be actually hard to tell, have I gotten everything out? And so in one case, they had looked around, thought they had everything, and they looked back on the display and realized, uh-oh, something hidden behind this swollen part of the brain was a little bit more tumor, and let's go in there and see what's going on. And they had an alignment then of the kind of pre-operative scan with the actual head, and they knew where to go in and look, and they found this thing and fixed it. It's also been used here to look at these data sets. So these are kind of different blood vessels and arteries around a tumor. And the question was, how do we block the arteries that give blood to the tumor, but not the ones that give blood elsewhere causing stroke, right? And so this was basically a complex 3D design problem. And by having all the different data sets of the geometry of the brain, the arteries, the tumor, they could then make this planning in a kind of common framework and do a better job at that. All right, so the simultaneous registered display of multiple data sets can give you better understanding than kind of side-by-side presentations, right? And the challenge is that it's really hard to do because they get in front of each other. And so a lot of the kind of research now in visualization is how do we do a very complicated multiple data set thing in multiple dimensions and get it all together. And it's a lot about how do we hide and show the appropriate things. And so we're going to be talking about that at length in this class. We're actually going to have a whole separate lecture on how do you do multivariate display, separate from the individual lectures. All right, so if I've convinced you now that it's theoretically useful and practically useful, now you're saying, okay, I want to do visualization, how would I go about doing that? So basically cataloged a number of tools here that show you kind of different things. There's the kind of, I just want to run it, thank you. There's a visualization application. It's if I want to do some analysis at the same time I do the visualization. Programming toolkits, I want to write something new. And graphical programming toolkits, which I'll explain. I list these here, and I'm going to go through, each of them is focused on a different area. So I'm going to go through briefly and touch on each of these, but largely this is for your benefit when it comes to final project time, or when you're after the class wanting to do something else. And this is just a pointer forward and information on where you might go. The first two are the ones that we're going to use in the class as kind of training to do the homeworks. You can use those or anything else here or anything else you want to use for the final project. So visualization applications, the first one, the one we're going to use most in this class, is called ParaView. It stands for Parallel Viewer. It's implemented to run in massive parallel on some big DOE supercomputer, but it also works fine on a laptop, right? And so we basically don't use most of it. That kind of talks to the other supercomputers, gets the results together and brings them back. And we just use the part that hooks filters together and render. It works fine for that. It's made by Kitware and Sandia National Labs, and a lot of other people around the world. It's based on the visualization toolkit, which I'll talk about in a bit. Open source, freely available, it's scriptable. So if you kind of want to do a new thing that it doesn't let you do, you can write a Python programmable plugin. I'll ask you not to do that for the homeworks because it'll kind of level the playing field and make you think harder. But for the final project, it's easy to extend or write your own plugins to put in to do new filters that weren't there in the first place. And we'll be using this in the class. VolView is also based on VTK, also comes from Kitware. It used to be a product. They've basically open sourced this whole tool. So it's now free. There's manual support available. It's primarily developed for medical visualization, but if you have other 3D data sets that it can load, it can be a very powerful way to display those as well. And you can kind of show the skin and the bones in different ways, and we'll kind of walk through how that all works. And we'll be using that, I think, for some of the homeworks in this class as well. And the reason we're doing that is that volume editing things in ParaView have, maybe there are 2 more releases away from catching up to the ones in VolView, right? So you can do a lot of the things in ParaView, but even more things in VolView.
Are those both written in Python? Or?
These are both written in C++,
Okay.
and then CableSwig is used to translate them into Python, TickleTK, Java, your favorite language. So there's bindings for a bunch of languages.
Okay.
And then there's, ParaView, VTK is written in C++ and CableSwig. ParaView is also written in C++, but its basic structure is actually a Python-based thing. So if you look at one of its saved state files, it's basically a Python script. And so internally, it calls the C++ through a native layer with a Python wrapper. I don't actually know what VolView is written in. I never looked at the source code. All right. There's another group at Los Alamos National Labs that is working on an application called Visit. It's essentially, from an outside view, very much like ParaView, designed for very much the same goals, done by a different group. They did a different thing, right? And so if I were starting the course, I might as easily have picked Visit as I picked ParaView. I happened to pick ParaView, and so now I've got all this, history and languages. That's the one we pick. But I wouldn't, if you kind of sat me down and said, why is this one better? I couldn't tell you the answer. Right? There's some benefits, some deficits. They're starting to come back together, but it's another choice. VTK Designer, again, based on VTK, freely available visualization package. Nsight is commercial software. It's a company based in Apex, North Carolina. The Renaissance Computing Institute's got some licenses for this, and it's got basically meshing modules, interfaces for a lot of popular computational fluid dynamics codes. So if you want to connect directly to the computational fluid dynamics, this may be the tool that you want to use for visualization. TechPlot is another commercial software. It's got an SDK for developers. It's scriptable. I've told you everything I know about TechPlot. All right. One that came from our National Research Resource that's aimed at 3D fluorescence microscopy is Image Surfer 2. It's basically peer review with some other things wrapped in to make it easy to read bioformats, to make it easy to do some image processing on the things, and then extract surfaces from that.
Do you know if that's free?
I do know that that's free.
Okay.
Yeah. And then there's Data Tank, which is written for the Mac by David Alsteinson and the Applied Math Group here at UNC. It was made to couple tightly to simulations and show you what's going on, and kind of help you steer and understand what's going on in the computations. He's offered in the past, he probably would offer again for students in the class that want to use it to give you a free license, and so it'd be worth contacting him if you have a Mac and want to couple to simulations. He's very strong kind of user support on this project. All right, ISYS is another commercial software. It's more InfoVis focused. So if you want to look at graphs and layouts and descriptions of networks, this would be more than the tools, the ones I've talked about so far. Vapor is a free software that's weather visualization focused and integrates with IDL. IDL is a programming language that a lot of people in that domain use. And so if that's something you know, that may be a good one to go for. Maya VI2 is another VTK based. You can never have too many VTK based free software packages to choose from, right? And this is useful for embedding into Python apps, right? So if you want to embed some visualization inside your app, that's what this is particularly focused on. Exposure render. So this is like applying all the coolest, latest techniques of volume visualization in a free software package, right? And so this is accelerated by your graphics card, which is kind of weird to say graphics accelerated rendering, right? That's what a graphics card's for. But basically, it's doing a volume rendering with very advanced techniques in kind of interactive rates for a variety of different tools. So if you really want high quality rendering, that's good. Open Walnut is another open source one. Basically, it's a medical and brain focus for diffusion tensor images in large part. And so you see these kind of streets of where water could go. It shows the connectivity of the brain, and it's focused on how do you display things for this. Volume Shop is another free for non-commercial use, advanced volume rendering techniques. Their thing is this is where it starts to get really gruesome. Peel the head open so I can see the thing inside, peel that open to see the brain inside, and kind of provide context and all kinds of interesting volume remapping in real time in the display. And finally, OpenView, which is, again, more information visualization. This is kitware starting to get into an application that is InfoVis rather than SciViz, whereas peer review is focused primarily on SciViz with starting to do some InfoVis. And last year when I looked at this, there was an alpha version for the Mac. Maybe by now it's out in that. All right. So that was a set of just out-of-the-box applications you could use to display things. Why don't you want to go a little bit? Go ahead.
So if I had a data set and I knew exactly the visualization I wanted, how long would it take to implement the visualization in one of these tools? Assuming maybe I even knew the right one to choose.
Yeah, so if you knew the right one to choose and you, it's easier for me to answer this question. Me, knowing peer review and the things that it can do, it takes me about 3 minutes to go from loading the data set to filtering it and getting an isosurface or a slice, depending on the size of the data set, right? It may take 10 minutes to...
But the actual
fiddling is pretty
yeah.
quick, yeah. Same thing, so from out of the box, you'll find out, because the first homework is going to be, do these 5 steps, or the tutorial will be do these 5 steps. So you can kind of time yourself and see how long it took. But I do courses that are half-day courses and take students through 2D scalar fields, 3D scalar fields, vector fields, and they've got kind of pictures for each of those by the end of the day. So it can be quick if what you're doing is something that's built in there for it to do. If you want to design a new visualization, then we can have to talk. Yeah. All right. Sometimes you want to not only do visualization, but also do image analysis, or primarily you want to do image analysis or simulation, and then you want to kind of show something, right? And so these are kind of all the other end of that spectrum. So ImageJ is done for image analysis, mostly 2D displays. They're starting now to have a 3D viewer to do basically tracking things in images, locating particles, doing statistics on images, doing filtering on images. It's ubiquitous in biology. MATLAB is, of course, the language of science, right? Is how they build it, and it's an easy way of thinking about programming in a language that maps well to matrices and matrix operations that lets you do simulations. They also have some plotting packages. If you beat them into submission, you can actually make them look pretty good, right? And so the defaults are all the horrible things, but there's settings for those. You can change the perspective, you can change the color map, you can make it not rescale itself every time you move around, so you can make them do some of the things that we talk about here. I won't be talking much about it. It's also very good at image filtering and other displays. Mathematica is if you kind of have a mathematical function, you want to do these things on closed form solutions, solving solutions. It's also very good at that. All right, so programming toolkits are, okay, maybe I wanted to sit down, I know how to do programming, and I want to quickly pull things together and display them, but I don't want to write the volume rendering app, I don't want to write the isosurface extractor, I don't want to write all the color mapping things, I want to kind of have those available. So the visualization toolkit at vtk.org is open source. Again, it's written in C++, but it's got bindings for these other languages. There's a large collection of algorithms, file readers, display programs. It's a little bit like an Easter egg hunt, right? Because you like thousands of classes with thousands of names, and so you kind of ask Google, help me find one, and it will point you down in documentation where the thing you're looking for. There's documentation though, and there's books, there's support by kitware, example code. This is kind of higher level than OpenGL. It's like give me an isosurface, color it by the temperature, rather than give me a triangle, color the 3 vertices, what these 3 colors are. It's a data pipeline model, getting your reader connected to my filter, connected to my isosurface extractor, connected to my color mapper, connected to my render, draw it on the screen, and it's aimed at programmers. The Insight Toolkit was sponsored by the National Library of Medicine when they realized that there's lots of image analysis techniques out there, but they're all scattered and they're hard to collect. So these collect them together. We need to basically segment and then understand image analysis on registration, segmentation on the visible human. And so this was Terry Yu's approach. Okay, we're going to fund people to do this. So this was funded by Kitware, by UNC, by a bunch of other groups around the world to pull the best of breed algorithms into one toolkit so you can have access to them as a programmer, right? So this is not what you want if you're an end user. This is what you want if you're working with an end user and you didn't want to write the kind of nonlinear diffusion type 7, Laplacian gradient, blah, 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 right? Because it's in there somewhere. It's highly templated, so get used to templates, and it's aimed at programmers. It's got a lot of examples. VizAD and Viz5D were developed by Bill Hibbert at the University of Wisconsin. It's Java-based. It's for collaboration across the network, so 2 people can work together on the same visualization. It's got the idea of visualization spreadsheets, so you can change parameters, change settings, and see a whole viewpoint of what things would look like. So you're exploring together this design space of visualizations and can use that. Skiron is developed at the University of Utah. It's, again, coupled to simulations, right? It's like a simulation framework with a visualization framework all hooked together into one thing with a data flow pipeline. So you can hook them together, you can do steering computations, the kind of what the electric field looks like around the thorax as you're kind of breathing and your heart is beating, showing, kind of simulating that, walking around in the cave to see that, seeing it on the display. So it's for tight coupling of parallel simulation to output. D3 is going again into InfoViz, right? So it's almost kind of like a plotting language and primitives for doing your kind of displays. And it's JavaScript. It binds to a document object model, and then you transform it. It's made to be fast, and it kind of makes use of all the cool acronyms, right, for rendering on your far side. So it's this is something that Chris Healy at NC State has used a lot. It likes it a lot for developing visualizations that run in the client, and so they run pretty quickly with the data that comes from the server. GGobi is a high-dimensional visualization focus, right? I've got a 15-dimensional data set, and I will understand how the points are distributed in this space. And it's got kind of ways of going, a dimensional tour where you see the different projections go from one to the other, and you can understand what's going on. It's got parallel coordinates, so you can see multiple viewpoints at the same time, and so forth. And the last one is Weave, and this is one I just heard about this last year at the Viz conference. This is George Grinstein at UMass Lowell. It started with him, and it's gone now to a bunch of different communities. And the idea is I wanted to do some programming so I can put a web-based visualization up that people can interact with and see what's going on. They've aimed at people in companies who have data they want to show that don't know anything about programming. So if you're a novice, they want you to be able to come in, plop your data, display it, manipulate it, see what's going on. But if you're an advanced programmer, it also supports kind of digging down in and doing more things as well. And again, talks about supporting collaboration. All right. So somewhere in between kind of the complete applications and the programming toolkits are what are called graphical programming toolkits, right? And the idea there is not doing programming by typing, weird esoteric strings into a computer, but programming by creating modules and connecting links between them, right? And so the data comes in, it flows out, it gets modified with these parameters, it flows out, it gets modified, it flows out. Something that you could do without having to learn, programming. More like Lego blocks than like NC milling, right? It's aimed to be directly used by scientists. And there's basically pre-built modules you can put together, and they try to be extensible. And so basically it's like, well, you can add your own module, and here's this, oh my God, terrible way if you have to do it, to make the module, right? Usually it's kind of how it is. Peer review is very much like this. So peer review is in fact a data flow application. You can put modules in. They don't happen to have it drawn graphically as a kind of connected objects, but rather in a tree diagram. And we'll see that when we start to use the application, but it's a similar thing. All right, so Viz Trails is, from University of Utah. It's VTK, built on top of VTK. The thing it does particularly well is remembers all your settings and all the past copies of settings you ever did, right? And so when you get to publish your paper and you go, oh, what was the setting for the isosurface in this picture? It remembers, right? Oh, but I tried the one that was twice as much. How did that look? Oh, it remembers. And you can either have it remember the world, or you can tell it, name this one this, name this one this, name this one this, and go back to that. So it's a way of not just doing a visualization, but understanding the entire process of how you got there. And then, if you like this way of doing visualization, they want to be able to say, okay, the thing that I did here, do it over here, right? Take this out and stick it in over there, so you don't have to remember to rebuild that tree every time. And so they're really working on data provenance, on kind of easily kind of reusable parts. They also have a spreadsheet, data restoration spreadsheet, so you can see those things across this. And the visualization by analogy is like you say, okay, this set of filters that I applied here, apply that over here. Do the same thing, and it tries to figure out what you mean by that. Open Data Explorer used to be a product by IBM. They stopped making it a product. They made it open source. There's a community out there. You can buy a T-shirt. They have a lot of things. When I originally looked at this back a long time ago, I had some issues with reading particular file formats I cared about. I'm sure it's gotten better since then. I ended up going with peer review and more. Iris Explorer is a commercial product. It's got user manuals. It's got online tutorials. AVS and AVS Express, this is what we used for the first several years in the visualization class because peer review wasn't quite up to what we needed to do for all of our techniques. It's commercial supported software. It's one of these link diagrams where you read the thing in, you modify it, and show the display. And there's manuals and good tools. We used it for a number of years. It was fine. Amira. Amira is the one that Rachel Brady used at Duke when she was running the visualization center there. Kind of her answer was, when I did something in Amira, it worked, it didn't crash, and it did what I expected. When I did something in peer review, sometimes it crashed, sometimes it did what I expected. I wasn't as confident about that, right? Okay. And so if you're kind of like, I want to spend the money, I want to get the Cadillac, I want to just think about making sure this works, that's one system you can imagine going with. There's a free trial, so you can try it out and see if it does what you want to do. It's got segmentation tools and various things as well. NodeBlocks is again an InfoViz equivalent. So I want to make a graphic that shows something that's kind of about data that's not spatially embedded, but it's just kind of from information. And it's open source, integrates into your design workflow. More InfoViz tools. And so on the web page and then here, there's a kind of selection database lab. They've got a list of all the InfoViz tools they could find, and here's kind of the first parts of them, and you can go there for the rest. So they have a whole giant list of those. All right. So this semester, as I mentioned, we're going to be using two VTK derived tools. One is peer review, and the other is VolView. And I used to do a lecture on how to do peer review, right? And that was like the most boring lecture to listen to and the most boring lecture to give. So now what I do is the first part of the homework will be just a step-by-step, do this, do this, do this, do this, stepping you through, here's how you do a color map. Here's how you do a height field. Here's how you do a contour. And then the second half is a design exercise. Think about, for this data set, which of these do you want to use. And so the learning on this will come as part of the homeworks, and it's very detailed. But if you get stuck, office hours are open, right? I was astounded that I didn't have people showing up at office hours, right, for the first time I did this in the class. I think it helps somewhat that you'll be teamed up with somebody, and so if one of you doesn't get it, the other often will. But, you know, I'm happy, overjoyed, I would rather do that than grade, have you come to my office hours and we talk about kind of how to run the tools, ideas for visualizations, and so forth. All right. Now for something completely different. So there's a lot of material in this course. You're getting the idea of this, right? There's all these, you know, visualization toolkits, there's all these perceptual psychology things, there's all these kind of methods you can use, there's all these talking to scientists things. And so what I got from feedback on the course reviews was it can be a little hard to figure out what's important for all the trees, right? And so what I'm doing here is kind of collecting ahead of time some of the important things to be looking for as we go along, and some of the important things to be thinking about as you're doing your designs. Right? I'm going to try to do this again kind of mid-semester and try to do it again at the end of the semester to give you some context for, you know, these are the things that really I think are matter. Don't, you know, do these things right, it'll go pretty well for you. So they're basically recurring themes. One category of these is perceptual issues. Something about how our brains work, our visual systems work. So it turns out that luminance, which is just brightness, is what we use for detail and shape, right? So if you don't have a change in luminance, you're not going to see a change in detail. You're not going to see that. If you vary the luminance of something, you vary its perceived shape, and you can't get away without that, right? So luminance, you have to think very carefully about in this class. In fact, one of the visualization researchers from back when used to talk about the contrast budget, right? Luminance and contrast are the same thing if you're in print. So he's saying, okay, we've got so much of a budget, what are we going to spend it on, right? If we spend it on seeing the shape of the object, we can't spend it on seeing the data. If we spend it on seeing the data, we can't use it on the grid, right? So how did you want to trade off your luminance budget? This is your most important resource in that. In 3D, the most important resource is going to be the occlusion budget. You know, what hides what's behind, but you know, in many things, luminance will be important. The other thing is the human visual system sees differences. It doesn't see absolute brightness levels. It doesn't see absolute colors. It doesn't see absolute size. It doesn't see absolute orientation. It's going to make you crazy when I show you some of the displays up here that convince you of this. So basically, it's true for this. The good news is this makes it so we can function in a world where when we go outside and the brightness changes by a factor of 10,000, we see things around us, right? And as things move around, they don't dissolve into kind of random bits, right? Everything works. So one consequence of that is the visual system, since it's so tuned to do that, is not able to do kind of brightness contrast. So if you took your kind of camera on your cell phone and you try to take a picture of like the person in front of the tree, in front of the sky, in front of the sun, what do you get? A big blinding thing here in black, right? And so that's a consequence of it being actually measuring absolute brightnesses and trying to do that across the whole field. And so there's this fundamental trade-off that has been made that makes it really good for us to walk around and eat things and whatnot, but not so good at seeing absolute precise values. And it can be hard to get this kind of in your gut and really understand that this is happening. And so we'll show some examples of this in the class. So pre-attentive processing. So some things we can do across the entire visual scene. Pre-attentive is a word that's kind of falling out of favor, but really the idea was you don't have to pay attention to do this. What that means is you don't have to look around everywhere to see this. You walk into a room, there's a blinking red light, you don't have to look everywhere, where's the blinking red light? It just pops out. You can see it instantly, right? Even if there are a bunch of green lights, even if there's a bunch of moving people, right, you can still see this flashing red light. So there's some characteristics, visual characteristics, that are pre-attentive that you can rapidly see across the whole field. So if you want the user to see something quickly and not miss it, it's good to map it to these channels, right? And so that's one way of thinking about it. Is, there's kind of the attention budget, there's the contrast budget. How do we get them to see what we want to see? We map it to the thing they can see easily. All right. Data manipulation, right? I mentioned this a little earlier in the lecture. Think about, is the data space that I got the data in the most appropriate space to show it in? Or is there some modified data space that I should be doing this in, right? So latitude and longitude onto a sphere is an obvious one. One of the things that I'm going to show in the kind of to the pain lecture is maybe the data that you got in has got some slope to it that's just because it happened to be scanned that way, not because the fundamental object in there is not flat, right? In that case, maybe what you wanted to do was flatten out the data, do your data set from the flattened data, not from the original data. Tell the scientists that you're doing this, right, so that they don't misunderstand. But, the question is, what's the right space? Is it the original space? Is it some artifact removed space that shows the thing that I want to see particularly clearly? The third thing is, do I want to get some derived data set? Do I want to compute the gradient magnitude? And is that what they really care about? Maybe I'll just compute that and show that instead of trying to figure out in color map how to make one that will be good to show the gradient magnitude. So do I want to compute some new data sets? Do I want to transform this? What's the best space to answer the question they're looking for? And then you're going to learn through the class various tricks for loading things into peer review, right? So one of these the insurmountable barriers for a scientist is, I've got my simulation, it spits out these 5 formats. I've got my visualization tool, it takes these 7 formats. None of them are the same, right? It's like, oh. And so for computer scientists, it's like, yeah, just write a script. And they're like, yeah, right, yeah, go write a novel.
The shell script. Yeah.
Go write a novel, go do a simulation, buddy. And so what I'm looking at is how do we kind of, given that problem, a lot of programs, for example, will spit out TIFF files, right? Or stacks of TIFF files. Okay, they won't have the full data range, but they'll at least give you the data, and most visualization tools read those. So that's one particular trick. So in the homeworks, you're going to see this trick, this trick, this trick. Here I've got a big binary data file. How do I get it into peer review? Well, you slap this magic header onto it. Let me tell you the 7 magic things you need to know, and you can read it in. Right? And so these are tricks that you can use to kind of bridge between the data formats you have and the data formats that it reads. And so those will be kind of obvious.
It actually brings up a question that's sort of been popping through my mind. Would you maybe redesign the experiment or the data collection to enable visualization?
So people are looking at that in 2 ways. One is, we've actually had clients from the class who didn't care what format they wrote their data in. They just happened to be writing it in the format they thought of, Saturday night when they finally got the program working and it was done. And they said, well, let me just write out BTK format, right? And then you can read it into your tool. And so if they're picking one anyway, might as well pick one that's readable. The second is, for supercomputing, right, the big push now is in situ visualization, right? The problem is you can't get all the data out of the supercomputer because the bandwidth out of the supercomputer is not big enough, right? So processors are getting faster than the networks are getting faster. And so it's in there, and it ran, and okay, what happened? 42, right? Was the answer. Okay, what was the question? And so the point is you want to export some projected subset, pull the isosurface out in there, pull the isosurface out, then you can at least change the viewpoint and see what's going on afterwards, and whatever data you sampled on that isosurface, right? So the question is, how do we build the visualization data collection into the simulation? So that you're indeed right. People are starting to look at this in 2 ways, and how do we do this? And this happens once you realize the value of visualization. So wow, let me think about this, not just as how do I make this work. And then there's kind of industry-wide standards like HD5 that was going to save the world. It's the one standard to kind of rule them all, and everybody was going to read and write this, except it's incredibly impossible to read and write because you have to link to all the blah. And so that, was the ones the future came. All right, choosing mappings. Choosing mappings is going to be really important. Choosing mappings is what I'm going to be grading you most on. Ooh, automatic shutdown. Okay. Why did you choose to use this color map as opposed to the other ones? Why did you choose this background color as opposed to the other ones? And the answer is that's the way it was when the Viz tool was turned on is not the answer, right? So choosing mappings turns out to be really important. And one particular mapping that's it's never the best, I have to phrase this carefully, right? I get into philosophical arguments with people about this. The continuous rainbow color map is never the best choice, and it's often misleading, right? And I'll have a lecture about why this is. I'm not saying it's not good sometimes. I'm not saying that the banded color map is not sometimes useful. I'm saying the continuous color map is the default and everything. There's always a better choice than it, right? So then I would ask, okay, if you care about the answer, why would you choose one that's not the best choice? And so if your answer at the end is the continuous color map, you should be thinking about, which one should I be using instead.
Do you mean specifically the continuous color map in the order of the rainbow? Like
Yep.
if you were to reorder the colors, it might be okay?
We'll have a discussion about that in
Okay.
the 2D scatter
Or
lecture.
you want something more specific? Yeah.
Yep. It turns out that no continuous color map shows interval data, right? This is an annoying fact of life. But I just want to use a color map that lets me see the values in my data. Ain't one.
Interval, can you define that?
Yes, I will later define that, but it means basically, so data is nominal, which means it's just names, has no relation to continents, our names, car companies are nominal. Ordinal, there's an order to it. Pizzas are this way,
Mhm.
right? They're small, medium, large, extra large. I can't tell you the relative, sizes of these, but they're ordinal. Interval, as you can tell, is this interval in the data the same as this interval, right? So it's, in other words, it's got a metric scale. It's like, dollars is this way, right? $10 to $20 is the same as, $5 to $15. Yeah. And so it's got interval rates. So there's no color map you can use. It's going to let you say, is this interval in this color part of the color map the same as this interval in this part of the color map?
Differential, basically, yeah.
Yeah. And then ratio is that plus it has a 0, so you can do a ratio of two things. It can be twice as much or half as much. So height is interval, height above sea level is ratio. And then, we can have a philosophical argument of is there any really difference between those. The important thing is that there's a 0. And that,
So the claim is that you've got a gradient from yellow to red and another one from green to blue. It's
Yep.
really hard to tell.
How much
whether
more
they're the
green
same
is
length.
how much more green than blue is this?
And
It's
we
not-
suck at that.
It's
so,
how much
yeah.
more yellow than
Yeah.
white this, and you can't do that. Yep. All right. Translucency without texture hides shape. Right. So I'm going to make the thing semi-transparent. It'll be great. It's great. You can see the thing behind it, but you're no longer going to see the thing that you're rendering. Right. You see the silhouettes, but you won't see the thing. This is the second trick we always want to play. Oh, the rainbow color map is great. And then we'll just use partial transparency to show. Yeah. No. Okay. And then the other important thing is, and this is going to, you're going to, how do I do this based on statistics, right? Every project ever done in this class got this wrong the first time, right? And I'll tell you, and I'll tell you, and I'll tell you, evaluate the visualizations objectively on their performance on tasks. Don't evaluate it based on how the user liked it. Don't evaluate on how you liked it. You evaluate by saying, the user's trying to ask the question, where is the highest point? Okay, I'm going to evaluate this technique by trying to answer the question, where is the highest point in a data set where I know where the highest point is, and see if I get the right answer. Right? So you want to evaluate it based on its performance at the task it's trying to do, not other criteria. Right? Multivariate display. So we wandered in the desert for 3 years, 4 years. You can always get the first 3, and you put the 4th one in, and everything falls apart. Okay, let's try it in a different order. Like there's a whole bunch of orders you can do this, and they fall apart, and I'll talk about why that is. But basically, once you've used up all your contrast budget, and once you've used up all your kind of texture size budget, you don't have any more. You can't just layer another thing on top without hiding something else behind. And so there's approaches you can do with that to basically say, okay, we're going to use one channel, maybe color, maybe orientation, and we're going to use that to specify which channel, and then we're going to overlay a bunch of those channels. So you kind of give up one of your degrees of freedom to show the visualization, use it to separate channels, and then you can layer the channels. So we'll talk about that in the multivariate lecture in particular. Again, this is another one that's you'll get, I think, pretty early on, is the best technique depends on the task, right? So if you say, what's the best way for me to show 2D scalar fields? Mu, right? So this is the Zen answer that unasks the question, right? You can't ask that question. The question is, for this task, what is the best visualization technique to do that, right? Just as we saw in the book here, right? The parallel thing, that if you take out the thing in front, you can see things you couldn't see. If you change the color maps, you can see things you shouldn't see. Which question you ask told you which was the best display, but there isn't one overall silver bullet that works for everything.
How frequently does the client know the question they want to ask or what they want to see?
Yep, there'll be another whole lecture on that. And so the
That's
question is,
a
how
common
often do scientists know what they want, right? So the first question is they aren't always able to articulate immediately the thing that they're asking. But if you keep asking them some questions, pretty soon they'll actually come up with something you care about. And the second is they don't know what you can do in visualization, so they don't know that they could ask some questions, right? So some questions to them are out of bounds because they're impossible, but then you show them the visualization and suddenly they become possible. And so you don't be frustrated by the fact that the first time you design a visualization, they say, oh, this is awesome, now I want this, this, and this, right? But they couldn't have jumped there because, if you have a new tool, if you have the map, you can plan your vacation. Oh, now I wanted to do this, right? Tell me how much it's going to cost in gas, right? And I didn't know it was supposed to tell me how much it was going to cost in gas because it occurred to me that was the whole thing. All right. The other thing is that different tasks may require different displays. So if you have 2 or 3 questions, you may in fact want to have 2 or 3 different displays. Sometimes if you can layer them on top of each other, that's good. And for 2 or 3, you can often get away with that. because you can see them in context, but you won't necessarily use one display that shows the answer to 3 questions. You may have 3 different techniques, either mixed together or side by side, that show the answer to multiple questions. Interacting with scientists. All right, so we're going to talk about this. I think I just did. No, I'm going to have a whole lecture on kind of communicating with scientists. And so one is there's this jargon, right? They're going to launch a bunch of terms at you. Some of those terms are nouns that you just store in your brain and you spit back. Same noun, same noun, same noun, same velocity, velocity. Okay, PMMA, PMMA. Okay, fine. I'm going to just use that term for that thing. I don't even have to understand that thing, right? PMCA and you do whatever they are. Some of them are deeper concepts. You need to understand that quark and gluon plasma, you've got these things called quarks and gluons, but let me tell you what a plasma is, right? So it is where they disassociate their own liquid soup, right? So you need to keep asking about that question and really understand the concept. And it's not as scary as it sounds like it should be, right? It's like liquid. Oh, okay, that wasn't too bad. All right. Learning to paint independent goals and tasks. All right, so you're going to look for science goals, not visualization techniques, right? So the question you want from the scientist is not, how should I render this? But what do you want to know about your data? And specifically, what do I want to know? Specific enough that I can pick one technique versus another if I know what you want to ask, all right? So do you want slicing or then tell me what you want to learn, and then we'll kind of figure out what's going on. And then you want to push them beyond what they think is easy. Well, what if I could do this? Well, what if you could have any magical technology that doesn't exist? And sometimes they'll ask you magical questions you can't answer, and sometimes they'll ask you questions that, oh, we can actually do that. And then everybody's very happy.
Do they often have a picture in their head that you're trying to discover?
They often have a picture in their head that's whatever visualization they've seen before, plus one thing. And so they'll be, listen to that plus one thing, because that may give you a clue about what they're trying to see, right? Or if you're a scientist, be thinking about, okay, if I could have anything, not just one thing beyond what I have, what would it be? And now in the class here, we're going to talk about, okay, what are all the techniques? Will that do what I want? Will that do what I want? Will that do what I want? And then embedding visualization into the workflow, right? So this is one that we keep learning over and over again. Great, I made you a pretty picture. Now I want some data out of it to put into my paper, right? So how do I get this into the workflow, not just this kind of one-off picture? And so there's importing their data from their format, and there's a kind of enabling quantitative querying are the 2 questions that they have. So kind of this is a quick list of the high topics that are coming. I'm going to delve into each of those in more detail in later lectures. Thank you for this, and I'll see you on whatever that class is, which is Thursday.